3.5 years after the start of the invasion, Russia finds itself facing a reality the Kremlin never planned to confront. What began as a lightning campaign to dominate Ukraine has turned into a war of attrition, draining resources, men, and credibility. In September 2025, the numbers speak for themselves. Over 22,600 units of equipment lost, including more than 4,100 tanks and 13,000 armored vehicles, double the Ukrainian casualties. To fill the void, Moscow is resorting to tanks pulled from rusty depots, some dating back to the World War II era. But the crisis extends beyond the battlefield. The Russian defense can no longer replace what it loses. A lack of skilled workers paralyzes factories, and sanctions suffocate the military budget. The result is a self-destructive cycle: less equipment, more casualties, less manpower to replace what is lost. Analysts at the IISS warn, if this pace continues, Russia could run out of operational tanks to sustain offensives by 2026. The military empire that intended to subjugate Ukraine is now fighting not to collapse under the weight of its own war. When Russia launched its so-called special military operation in February 2022, the plan seemed simple: capture Kyiv in a matter of days, depose the Ukrainian government, and install a pro-Moscow regime. It was an operation designed to be swift, surgical, and to demonstrate to the world the irresistible force of the Russian army. But this vision crumbled with a speed that not even the most optimistic analysts could have predicted. What was meant to be a lightning campaign has turned into a war of attrition that has now dragged on for almost 4 years, and threatens to consume Russia's military power itself. Putin, who expected a political and symbolic victory, now finds himself trapped in a war that can only be won by the enemy's exhaustion, or his own. The Russian strategy has come to depend on sheer brute force: daily artillery strikes, successive mobilization, and the attempt to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses through fatigue. It is the classic war of attrition, where time becomes both a weapon and a sentence. At the beginning of the invasion, Russia seemed invincible. The country possessed the largest tank stockpile in the world, one of the largest air forces in Europe, and an overwhelming number of armored vehicles and artillery pieces. Columns of armor stretched for dozens of kilometers, and the perception among the soldiers themselves was that victory was just a matter of days. Kyiv would be taken, the Ukrainian resistance would crumble, and the West would be forced to accept the new map of Europe. It was the portrait of a power confident in its own myth. But the reality was brutal. The Ukrainian resistance not only survived, it adapted. What began as a desperate defense evolved into a smart war, based on information, technology, and precision. Meanwhile, Russia began to lose equipment at a rate that no modern army could sustain. Tanks, planes, and armored vehicles were destroyed by the thousands, and the effort to replace them revealed a military industry pushed to its limits. Today, the difference between the Russian force on paper and the one that actually exists on the battlefield is immense. What we see is an army that, despite continuing to advance on some fronts, does so at an increasingly unsustainable cost. With each passing month, Russia loses not only vehicles and ammunition, it also loses the ability to maintain the very pace of the war. And it is at this point that an inevitable conclusion begins to emerge. The country may win battles, but it is unlikely to win against time. And it is precisely this silent erosion, this war that drags on against the very structure of Russian power, that defines the current conflict. Because the real threat to Moscow may not lie in Ukrainian weapons, but in the internal wear and tear of an army that is being slowly consumed by a war it cannot win. This is the foundation upon which the rest of our analysis rests. From here, we will see how this process of exhaustion manifests in the numbers, in the material losses, and in the strategic decisions that are shaping the fate of the war. To understand the scale of the problem Russia faces today, one must look at the numbers, and, more than that, understand where they come from. Among the various sources monitoring the conflict, one stands out for its precision and transparency: Oryx. It is an independent database created by open-source intelligence analysts that visually records every piece of military equipment lost, whether destroyed, damaged, abandoned, or captured. Each listed item is confirmed through photos or videos, making Oryx one of the most respected sources in the world for measuring the real material impact of the war. But it is important to note, Oryx's data is conservative. It represents only the losses that have been visually confirmed. In other words, for every tank or vehicle confirmed on the lists, there are others that were destroyed off-camera, or in areas where there is no access to record. This means the real number is, without a doubt, even higher. Even so, the official numbers are already devastating. As of September 2025, Oryx has recorded over 22,600 pieces of Russian equipment destroyed, damaged, or abandoned on Ukrainian territory. This includes tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, airplanes, helicopters, and even naval vessels. The number is more than double the losses recorded by the Ukrainian side, a statistic that completely dismantles the narrative that Russia is dominating the battlefield through sheer volume of fire. Among these losses, armored vehicles are the clearest symbol of Russian attrition. More than 13,000 armored vehicles have been destroyed since the beginning of the invasion, an industrial bleeding that no country, no matter how large its arsenal, can sustain indefinitely. And the picture is even more critical when it comes to tanks. More than 4,100 Russian tanks have already been destroyed or severely damaged. This means that, in practice, Russia has lost the equivalent of almost all the armored units that made up its active formation in 2022. The impact of this goes beyond statistics. Every lost tank is a symbol of offensive capability that disappears. Every destroyed armored vehicle represents a gap in the lines of attack, a delay in logistics, and a hole that is increasingly difficult to fill. The Russian industry is trying to react, but it faces technological bottlenecks and a growing dependence on foreign components, which limits large-scale replacement. This dynamic is already worrying international analysts. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, published a grim forecast. If Russia maintains the same rate of losses observed in 2024, the country will run out of enough tanks to conduct effective offensive operations starting in 2026. In other words, even if it continues to mobilize new recruits and invest in emergency production, the mechanized heart of its army, the armored forces, may simply cease to exist as a decisive force on the battlefield. This is the cruel mathematics of destruction. With each passing month, the Russian army finds itself less able to replace what it loses and more dependent on defensive tactics, improvisation, and propaganda. The war of attrition that Moscow believed it could win is, little by little, beginning to turn against it. And it is precisely at this point that a new layer of the crisis emerges: how Russia tries to compensate in practice for the loss of its mechanized power. This is the transition that takes us to the next chapter: Moscow's desperate effort to keep alive a war machine that is disintegrating from within. When the invasion began, the power of Russian armor seemed incontestable. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, in 2022, Russia maintained about 3,300 modern tanks in active service, models T-72, T-80, and T-90. These were vehicles considered the core of the country's mechanized forces, with decades of technological improvements, reactive armor, and state-of-the-art targeting. This fleet represented the pride of the Russian military industry and the basis of offensive doctrine. For Moscow, it was unthinkable to imagine a war without tanks leading every advance. But 3 years later, this fleet has practically confirmed combat losses exceed 3,100 modern tanks. That is, almost the entire active force that existed before the invasion. The T-72s and T-80s, which were supposed to form the backbone of the offensives, were decimated in intense fighting in Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia. Even the newest T-90s, considered the pride of the Uralvagonzavod factories, did not escape. Images of T-90M Fak-I Proryev tanks in flames, captured by Ukrainian drones, have become a symbol of the collapse of Russian mechanized superiority. Unable to keep up production in the face of daily losses, Moscow began to resort to what was left of its vast Soviet-era depot. In theory, Russia still had between 5,000 and 17,500 tanks in storage, a number that seemed to offer an inexhaustible reserve. In practice, however, many of these vehicles had been abandoned for decades, without maintenance and without spare parts. Even so, faced with necessity, they began to be reactivated. First came the T-62s, tanks designed in the 1960s, seen again in combat, starting in May 2022. Then, in an escalation that seemed unthinkable, even older models began to appear, such as the T-55s, and even the legendary T-34s, manufactured during World War II. In November 2024, images of convoys with T-34s being transported to training areas went viral on the internet, marking a symbolic moment: the return of a museum piece to the battlefields of the 21st century. These decisions are not merely symbolic, they reveal the degree of exhaustion of the Russian arsenal. Modern warfare requires tanks with digital sensors, integrated communication, and active protection against guided missiles. The old Soviet models, even when refurbished, have none of this. Sending them to the front is, in practice, accepting even greater losses. But for the Kremlin, it is a forced choice. either put outdated tanks into combat or admit that there are no longer enough tanks. The Russian industry tries to react, but it faces harsh limits. The current production capacity is about 250 modern tanks per year, and that includes new mod and modernized versions of old vehicles. The problem is that the rate of destruction on the battlefield far exceeds this replacement. In some months of 2024 and 2025, confirmed losses surpassed the annual production of the entire industry. The math is relentless. For every tank produced, several others are destroyed. The result is an increasingly uneven armored force, a mix of scarce modern tanks and obsolete vehicles operating side by side in extreme conditions. This progressive degradation is not just material, but also moral. Russian soldiers know they are entering combat with machines designed for wars of half a century against enemies equipped with 21st century precision weapons. It is a difference that not even propaganda can hide. And it is in this scenario of decay that the true picture of the current Russian army is formed. A nuclear power that, on the conventional battlefield, struggles to maintain the appearance of strength. In the next topic, we will see how this reality has forced the Kremlin to change not only its military strategy, but also its narrative, trying to transform weakness into a discourse of resistance. The war of attrition is not measured only in lost armor. It also erodes the backbone of any army, its artillery and its air force. In Russia's case, these two pillars are in open crisis. Since the beginning of the invasion, Russia has relied on firepower as its main advantage. In many periods of the war, Russian forces fired between 40,000 and 60,000 artillery shells per day, an intensity that no other country in the world could sustain. But this power comes at a price. According to Western intelligence estimates, Moscow consumes about 3.65 million shells per year, while its industry can only produce approximately 2.3 million. The difference is colossal. Without the internal capacity to meet its own demand, Russia has become dependent on foreign partners, and none has been more important than North Korea. Recent reports indicate that Pyongyang supplies up to 100% of the shells used by some Russian units on the front line. It is a humiliating dependence for a power that prided itself on its military sufficiency. But dependence is not the only problem. The quality of the North Korean material is extremely dubious. Approximately half of the shells sent are defective, and many of them date back to the 1970s and 1980s. This means constant failures, premature detonations, and an ineffectiveness rate that compromises the precision and safety of the Russian troops. On several fronts, soldiers report that the artillery falls silent for hours, simply for lack of usable ammunition. The firepower that was once a symbol of Russian dominance has become a portrait of scarcity and improvisation. And the same scenario is repeated in the skies. The Russian Air Force, which started the war as one of the most powerful on the planet, today operates at less than 75% of its pre-invasion capacity. The losses are not limited to direct combat. A large part of them comes from wear and tear, accident, mechanical failures, and a lack of spare parts. It is estimated that Russia loses, on average, about 60 aircraft per year. The industry, however, can only produce about 25 new ones. The result is a growing and impossible to compensate for deficit in the long term. With fewer available aircraft and increasingly lethal Ukrainian air defenses, Moscow has been forced to change tactics. The missions seeking air superiority, which marked the beginning of the war, have practically in their place. Russian pilots have started launching glide bombs from long distance, avoiding getting close to enemy lines. This change protects the crews, but it drastically reduces the accuracy of the attacks, making them increasingly ineffective against mobile or fortified targets. The sky, which at the beginning seemed to belong to Russia, is now a contested territory, and this profoundly alters the balance of the conflict. Without air dominance and with artillery operating at its limit, the Russian army is losing its ability to dictate the pace of the war. From here, the narrative turns to the strategic consequences of this erosion. How Moscow tries to maintain the appearance of strength, even in the face of an increasingly evident technical and logistical collapse. The war of attrition doesn't just claim tanks, planes, and ammunition. It claims people. After nearly 4 years of combat, estimates indicate that Russia has already surpassed the mark of 1 million casualties, including killed and wounded. It is a number that represents not only the collapse of a generation, but also the evidence that the country is fighting a war it cannot sustain. To compensate for the losses, Moscow has begun to employ tactics known as human waves, sending large groups of poorly trained soldiers into frontal assaults against fortified positions, with little or no armored support. This brutal approach, used by the Soviet Union in World War II, now returns as a sign of desperation. And the result is predictable. Even greater losses and minimal territorial gains. But the crisis is not only in the trenches, it has also taken over the factories that keep the war machine running. The Russian defense industry today faces an estimated deficit of up to 400,000 workers, including about 80,000 engineers. The factories are operating continuously, but there is a lack of technicians, operators, and specialists to maintain production. The workforce is aging, with an average age close to 45, and skilled young people are disappearing from the assembly line. Many have fled the country to escape mobilization, while others have been sent directly to the front. This shortage of skilled labor affects not only the quantity, but also the quality of what is produced. Tanks leave the factories with flaws, missiles have defects, and the replacement rate remains far below the needs of the battlefield. Meanwhile, the economy that sustains the entire war effort is beginning to show clear signs of exhaustion. Oil and gas revenues, the Kremlin's main source of foreign currency, have fallen by about 35% in just 1 year due to sanctions and reduced export to the West. At the same time, defense spending already consumes approximately 40% of the entire Russian federal budget. This means that almost half of the state's money is channeled in a war that shows no signs of victory. And even so, the military risks are infinitely limited. The Kremlin has already admitted that the current pace is sustainable. Official plans indicate spending starting 2026, a veiled acknowledgement that the war economy has collapsed. What once seemed like a dispute over territory has turned into a struggle for the survival. Russia is trapped in a war that is devouring its industry and its ability to finance its own future. The enemy now is not just Ukraine, it is time, the economy, and its own national exhaustion. In the next and final chapter, we will see how this scenario of total attrition redefines the strategic balance and marks the beginning of the end of the war of attrition that Russia can no longer win. After nearly 4 years of war, Russia finds itself trapped in a cycle that seems impossible to break. The equipment losses, the labor shortage, and the economic collapse feed each other, weakening all the pillars that sustain the war effort. Every destroyed tank requires new resources, which require more workers, who in turn no longer exist. Production falls, the cost increases, and the weight falls on an economy already operating at its limit. It is a vicious cycle of attrition that turns every tactical victory into a strategic defeat. Russia still fights, but it fights increasingly against its own exhaustion. Faced with this scenario, Vladimir Putin finds himself facing 3 paths, all of them bad. The first would be to retreat, drastically reduce operations, and try to preserve what is left of the army. This decision, though rational from a military point of view, would be interpreted internally as an admission of failure. The second path would be to continue at the same pace, prolonging the war and pushing the military machine to total collapse. In that case, experts predict that by 2026, Russia would simply no longer have enough tanks, ammunition, or pilots to maintain large-scale offensive operations. The third path would be to negotiate, to seek a ceasefire, try to turn the stalemate into a political victory, and freeze the war before the ruin becomes complete. But this option carries a personal risk for Putin, that of being seen as weak, a traitor, or defeated, opening an internal power crisis that he may not survive. None of these alternatives offers a stable future. They all expose a reality that the Kremlin has tried to hide from the beginning. Russian military power has limits. These limits are already being. No matter how much Moscow tries to maintain the narrative of heroic resistance, the truth is that the war of attrition has become a war against time, and time is not on Russia's. The illusion of strength is unraveling, revealing an exhausted country, a fragmented army, and a leader cornered by his own decisions. The end of this conflict may not yet have a date, but the outcome is already written in the statistics, in the idle factories, and in the trenches full of casualties. The war that began as a demonstration of power is ending as a cruel reminder. No superpower is invincible in the face of reality. If you want to continue following analyses like this, subscribe to the Military Warning channel and turn on notifications. We have new videos every week with detailed information about the behind-the-scenes strategies of the world's biggest conflict.